So I'm Joelle, and I'm Managing Director here at Larj.
And I'm Tina. So we are a certified women-owned podcast agency out of Seattle. We're sisters. I run the creative side, and Joelle runs the operations.
We really think of ourselves as story first. A lot of podcast agencies came together as marketers, and that's a fine thing. But we really are committed to weaving story into our shows, and that's kind of the way we, I think, offer a little special sauce to what we do. It comes from her.
Okay, so how do we think about podcasts? This is really important, this sort of foundational understanding of this medium, because it's the most unique media. Well, it's unique to any others because of one key factor, and that's the intimacy level. So if we think about how people listen to podcasts, they listen with earbuds in their ears while they're doing something else. And so that intimacy level is really unique and really an important thing to consider as you're creating content or telling stories.
When you're thinking about having this intimate experience, you've got earbuds in your ear, and there's no other ambient noise coming in, and so you're very attuned to what you're hearing. And what's really interesting is there's a science behind, why this is such a powerful medium in the and why story, neuroscience behind why story is so sticky. So what they did, there was a study in Berkeley where they took some subjects and put them in an MRI and played the Moth Radio Hour for them. And if anybody's familiar with that podcast, it's extremely story driven. And it's one voice just unfolding a story over maybe 15 or 20 minutes. And what they found when they observed this in an MRI is that the brain was lit up all around. Instead of just the language part of your brain that lights up when you're talking or having a conversation, it lights up the whole brain as if your brain believes this is really happening to you. And that is what creates such a sticky memory and allows people to really become immersed and learn this story so that they can actually retell it. And
the thing to think about too is, as I said before, earbuds in your ears listening, right? So that intimacy level is so powerful, and your brain is making up and connecting all of these dots. So when you think about that for change making or nonprofits or story, it's helping people really develop language around a certain topic, because the brain's working so hard, and you're able to remember the story or the information you're being told in that way. And also, when you think about that, as I said before, people are listening when they're doing something else. So there's the activities that they're doing have a low cognitive burden. So their brains are really focused on what they're listening to. And the reason I kind of beat this over the head a little bit to our clients or when we're working on content is because it just can't be underestimated. And when you're making content, you really want to think about where someone is when they're listening, and that intimacy factor, and the fact that it's a relatively unforgiving medium in that way. So who are the people listening? They tend to be curious, affluent, and relatively young. Which is also, important to understand as you're thinking about messages that you want to tell, that this audience is going to go back into the content that that they're listening to. They're going to go check out your website. They want to learn more about you. When they hear your voice or the guest, they want to look them up because they're curious.
We're learning too, this more data is coming up about Gen Z, which is 8 to 24-year-olds. And what power they have in purchasing power, but also they're very motivated to align what they do with their values, and they're seeking authenticity and meaning in their exchanges, their community. So podcasting is really poised to tap that population. They're already the fastest growing podcast listening audience, and so we're really excited about what's possible with this generation and how engaged they are in issues and mission that matter to them.
So why do people listen to podcasts?
Okay, we know that among the top 5 reasons that people listen to podcasts, entertainment, quite honestly, is the number one reason. But learning is a huge motivator. And I think if anybody here, and I'm suspecting that we have podcast listeners in this crowd, probably are coming to podcasting for the same things. It's listening, it's learning, and then hearing the opinions of other people, and then also getting inspiration or encouragement. I think that is really powerful for mission-driven organizations to understand that that's how their audience is coming to them. They're already seeking to learn. They want to hear what other people think, and they want to grow and be inspired.
Like kind of a know more, do better crowd. I always use that term. So one of the awesomest things about podcasting is that it can become the pillar of your communications ecosystem. So when we're creating content, we're creating your podcast content. We're creating assets for your entire social media ecosystem. So blog articles, LinkedIn articles, video for Reels, TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. So it's not just a podcast that you're creating. So in this cycle of making a show, you can be making and sprinkling out so many other things. And I'll just add to that, in addition to creating all of that content, you're also teaching yourself and your listeners so much more about the topic at hand. So it's just like this very incredibly immersive medium that also you can sprinkle out to all your other channels.
I think a lot of organizations are under the assumption that we already do a newsletter. We already have all this social. We don't need yet another thing. But what happens with the podcast is not a standalone thing by itself. It actually is a thing that you harvest. To Tina's point, you harvest content out of it for all the rest of these channels, and so it's a nice
bang for your buck.
Right, bang for your buck.
So what are the advantages of podcasting among the other things that we were talking about earlier? You're able to reach a community where they are, and in their me time, as we said before, they're listening while they're doing another thing. But this is a time when you normally wouldn't be able to reach people with your messaging. So and also the intentional way that people access podcasting is that they're going to an app and they're deciding the topic that they want to reach. So you're really reaching the exact audience you want in a time when they're in their me time.
Mm-hmm. Sarah, I saw your question and it's a great one. We have a slide on some of the shows we've made in this space and we'll talk a bit about them.
Yeah.
I want to cover off on a couple other key things here. We've talked a little bit about building fluency and creating language that when a person's listening to a podcast, they start to develop fluency in issues that can be complicated. So if you think of something like climate or certain policy issues, that can be very hard to just convey in a video, in a 90-second video, or in a format that gives somebody a moment of emotion and then it's gone. But with a podcast, because they're coming back on a regular basis over and over, you can really unpack complexity in that environment. And then they are becoming the kind of people that can go talk about it with others. Now they're hearing themselves talk and going like, I actually understand this stuff, becoming passionate advocates for a concept that they previously cared about, understood, conceptually, but had a lot of difficulty being able to share it. So once they become, now they're out in the world talking about it, they're getting their peers and cohorts excited about it.
It's like you're growing ambassadors.
Yeah, exactly. Really building a community. That's the other last kind of thing I want to talk on this slide is that when you think about an organization that puts a podcast out, the people within the organization are also listening to that, and they're building, their own capabilities too, learning about it. It becomes a recruiting tool for people who want to come and work for your agency, and they begin to learn more, and it's a training tool internally. And then it's also, you're informing your board, your, leadership and volunteers. So it is a tool that really builds across inside, from within the organization and all the way out into the community. So Sarah's question about some of the shows that we've made, I just want to touch on because We started early on doing some podcasts that we funded ourselves. We did a social justice show called
Battle Fatigue?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which was coming around 2020 after the murder of George Floyd, and that was a really engaging show. We did the B Team, which is a podcast that was funded by the B Team, and the show is called 10X Bolder.
And so that the B Team is they created a new corporate playbook, which is inspiring and educating corporate leaders on how to lead with people, place, and profit. So they were telling stories about the leaders inside the B Team and kind of really humanizing the leaders in the B Team about and helping people understand that they care as much about these issues as they are advocating for, and kind of how they live their lives.
We're really targeting multinational corporations because the B Corp model really affects smaller companies. It's been targeting more privately owned and just smaller companies, but multinational companies, they feel the B Team is funding because they want to make change globally.
But I will say one show that we did that I would call advocacy based is out right now. It's called Nobody Should Believe Me. And the woman set out to really educate the public about Munchausen syndrome by proxy, or medical child abuse. And that show has had a tremendous impact because survivors have come out of the woodwork. And it's really kind of grown awareness about a very relatively unknown issue in our society. And it's become a really powerful voice for that, because the story that we told in that show was very heartfelt and was full of emotion and some drama. So those are some of the shows that we have that have that are kind of in the sphere of change making.
To your question, Sarah, about impact, well, for Nobody Should Believe Me, one of the things that we're trying to affect is helping people who have exposure to kids in places like, healthcare workers, teachers, daycare workers, caregivers, to recognize the symptoms and start to understand more about how medical child abuse presents itself. And what we found is that there's an increase in activity. We send everybody this nonprofit Munchausen by proxy.
MunchausenSyndrome.com.
Yeah. And so the growth in that environment and the phone calls they're getting and reports has grown a lot. I don't have exact numbers on hand, but we know that that's it's made a huge difference. And we've seen it in the comments too on our, in Apple Podcasts, people are saying things like, oh my God, I'm sure this is something
happened to my family, or
people are starting to spot it. So,
and then we'd be remiss to not mention Living Change, a quest for climate leadership, which is a really important show that Andrea Learned is our host, and she's really inspiring people to walk the walk when it comes to climate. So she's talking to leaders about who are actually doing something in their lives and making a difference. So people like Eric Adams out of New York, who is vegan. So he cares about climate and he's acting in his own life. And so that's another one of our shows. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people think about size of audience and that, like, those numbers being the most important. And the thing about podcasting, and I say this often to our clients, is even if you had 50 people standing in front of you week after week, listening to what you have to say for a half hour or longer, if you imagine that audience, that's powerful. 50 is powerful because that's 50 change agents, right? Or advocates for what you're saying. So when you and multiply that 100 or 500, that's still a very significant number of people that are really of the right targeted people listening to you week after week. So that's just.
I think people are surprised when they see these numbers, like under 4,000 downloads is the top 1% of podcast listening. It is the perception, because you get these big noisy podcasts and these really super popular ones that are getting millions and millions of downloads. So then it's the perception of, oh, we could never, we just won't have enough audience. And that's why we really like to talk about the power of your exact specific audience coming back to you week after week. And when we plan a podcast, we spend a lot of time talking about who is it that we're really trying to reach? Where are they? What's our strategy for reaching them? Time spent listening is a big factor that we care a lot about. How much time a listener spent, with your show. Where are they dropping off? If they're dropping off, which, they don't really, they tend to stick through at least 80% of the podcast, but that's how you know you're reaching your audience. If they continue to listen all the way through, you've captured them.
Before I go on to the how we work, assessing ROI of a podcast is really a great question. So there's multiple ways to measure an ROI of a podcast. And the thing that we think about, we start with is who's your audience and what do you want them to do when they're done listening to your podcast? Do you want them to, some people, buy your book, go into your website, follow you on social media, donate to your cause, apply for a job? So when we think about what we really do a lot of work in pre-production, which is kind of, we're coming up to this right now about the how we work, of identifying what is your core messaging, what is the thing that you really want to say to an audience, who is that audience, who do you want to hear it, and then what do you want to come of it? What do you want to come of it? So all those, so when we look at that goal of what you want to come of it, we really dig deep into how to tell that story so that that thing will happen. So that then you know that people will watch your social media rise. We'll watch anecdotally, like a restaurant show that we had, anecdotally, everybody that was coming into the restaurants, this is called Seattle Kitchen, Tom and Thierry, that everyone coming into the restaurant would say, oh, I listened to your podcast, or I'm here because I listened to your podcast. So their goal was brand affinity and people coming into the restaurant.
Another really good example of anecdotal feedback being a really powerful measure of ROI. When you have a small audience, for example, when we did the B team, our host, she went to Davos, and there's maybe 150 really important global companies that B team wants to impact, wants to affect and get the attention of. So when she's at Davos, if one of those CEOs comes up to her and says, oh, I listened to your podcast, I'm really excited to hear about your leadership playbook, that is that's a huge success factor. So thinking about ROI is not as much, there is data, and we will always tell that story, but understanding really what is going to be the game changer, what's going to really move the needle for your organization, that's how we construct a podcast and an audience development strategy to actually really touch those things.
Did that answer? So we just wanted to share a little bit about how we work so you understand the process of creating a podcast. There are 4 kind of phases. Yeah. Boy, not enough coffee this morning. There are 4 phases. Jumpstart's how we start every engagement with every client. And that is when we dig into
just what we were talking
those
about.
3 questions. Yeah. Yep. Production's the time we hit record. That's the time that we're in studio or maybe even in the field collecting sound. Post-production is your editing, story structure, and then we head off to publishing and promotion. And most of our shows, we recommend no less than about 12 episodes. The idea is you're consistently building audience. And people may find you at episode 3, and then they'll start and go back to your library and start at episode 1. So you're just constantly building your audience. Which is why, again, when we talk about the power of this medium, that's another thing.
Sometimes a story told over, you can do one story told over multiple episodes, or you can have individual standalone episodes and, repurpose that content in a lot of different ways. So the amount of episodes we'll make has more to do with the story and the goals than any kind of best practice in the industry.
This is just an idea to show you the team that it takes to create a really good show. These are different roles and can be different individuals.
When we think about structuring a team with another organization, we sort of try to look inside the organization to see there's going to be some subject matter experts that are going to contribute. There's going to be some listeners, creative approvers, but there might also be people within your organization that have the skills to participate in part of the production life cycle. And so we will help, we'll either support that and be sort of incorporate some of your team with ours, or we can take the whole thing in-house ourselves, or we can train folks in your organization to sustain it long-term without any dependency on us. So we kind of come at it whatever way makes most sense for our clients.
This is generally how long it takes for production. This is how we kind of approach timelines.
So the jumpstart typically takes around 6 to 8 weeks. And then we start moving into production sometimes before it's fully finished. But because part of the jumpstart, we do get into the studio and we start making some content, we become, ready to get to publishing, even though there's still a little bit of strategy maybe still to go, or we're still building the social media channels out, or show art, or some of those other things.
That is all. We have a list of resources we will also make available to you.
We're leaning more and more into doing work with more values aligned organizations. We think it's our best work, and we're working on one for democracy right now that we're really excited about. And then we are aiming in the next quarter to spend more time focusing in
the space.
Yeah, change leaders, nonprofit organizations. So.
Oh,
how would I make
that's a great question. So one of the things that we just came back from a storytelling conference, storytelling for nonprofits. That was really interesting. And because a lot of nonprofits and changemakers are relying on video. And the thing about video is it's great. It's a very powerful medium. It serves there's a lot of reasons to do video. The reason to do a podcast is just a longer, deeper dive into a story or your messaging from your organization. That longer, deeper dive, and it just lasts a lot longer. So
we suggest you allocate your video budget to podcasting.
I mean, kind of, or just being intentional about your channels, right? So your video, it's going to work for your, social media properties for a short time, and it's going to be evocative, and it's going to hit your person one time. Whereas a podcast, they're coming back intentionally week after week, so it's just a different medium, and when you think about budget, I think the thing that we talked about before is harvesting the content from your podcast to all of your other channels. So you're not just making a podcast, you're feeding all of these other beasts at the same time. And that can be incredibly economical.
Yeah. But it's an investment that pays over time, because you can, depending on how evergreen you make that content, people are going to go back to the very beginning of that library and listen to the whole podcast from beginning to end. And so they discover it in episode 8, or they discover it a year after it's done publishing. It's still out there. You can remarket it. So it goes a long way at that budget, and can be a really great tool for newcomers to your subject matter, depending on, obviously goals and how you make it.
Okay, I think we're good.
We have a deck called How to Make a Business Case for Your Podcast, which is available. I think we're making it. I think if you're interested in it, link in, and I'd be happy to send it to you. I think we have it as a downloadable as part of this.
Yeah, we'll send it.
Yeah.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks a lot for coming.
Thank you.